Welcome, everyone, to Leading with Empathy and Allyship. I'm your host, Melinda Briana Epler, the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. So this series goes deep, it gets real. We build empathy for underrepresented and historically marginalized people, and we provide tangible, actionable steps that we can all take to be better allies and advocates for each other. On screen, we have Jasmine, an ASL interpreter. The ASL interpretation is sponsored by Interpreter Now, a deaf-owned company that we're really proud to partner with. Okay, so today we are discussing strengthening LGBTQIA+ leadership in the workplace. Please welcome a great friend and colleague, Jennifer Brown. Jennifer is the founder and CEO of Jennifer Brown Consulting, JBC. Welcome.
Thanks, Melinda. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you and I could offer hours about this stuff, and we have.
Yes, we have.
And we only have an hour, so we're going to talk specifically today about LGBTQIA leadership. We'll leave a little bit of time maybe to talk about a few other things, but we're going to focus mostly on that, even though we have, we could talk about a breadth of things. So briefly, can you tell us your story of how you came to be working on diversity and inclusion? What brought you there?
Well, accidental, as is probably true for a lot of us that end up in this work. And yet looking back, it all strangely makes sense too. I was a nonprofit activist in my 20s, so working for community justice organizations, loved it, but was also an opera singer on the side. So I'm not sure a lot of people remember that about me, but it brought me to New York to make it, allegedly. And I got a master's degree in operatic vocal performance here in New York City and became equity and did theater. And but sadly, I kept injuring my voice. And so I had to get several rounds of vocal surgery, which basically deprived me of the ability and really the instrument that could perform 8 times a week for months at a time. And so I had to reinvent, and performers, some go into HR because we're people, hopefully. And I kind of followed some mentors' advice and found my way to this field that I didn't know had existed, which is leadership development. And I ended up becoming a corporate trainer, like somebody that delivers training over and over again, and in various company settings, usually in organizations, and was in HR for a while, head of training and development, and then went out on my own. And at the moment I was laid off, I said, I think I need to be outside the organization, influencing in, because my point of view was crystallizing about all the things that were broken that I had heard over and over again in the corporate training classroom. And I think I wanted to be a part of fixing that, but fixing it on my own terms and not really working for somebody in that context. So the company built and I started to build my team, but I'm also being LGBTQ and I've been out since I was 22. I had always done that on the side and been very active in out and equal workplace advocate. So some people on this call may know what out and equal is, but it's specific to LGBTQ plus inclusion in the workplace. And I was on one of the first local boards in New York 15, 17 years ago. And I was at the table with all these incredible people who were building their company's first LGBTQ marketing strategy, talent strategy. IBM was there, Merrill Lynch was there, Deloitte was there, and these were my friends. And I got to learn, what is an ERG? There's something called the Chief Diversity Officer. I didn't know that. And so I was able to join my leadership development and organizational change background with my identity, and consult from this place, not just of expertise, but personal and lived experience. And I think that's when we pivoted the company in that direction. And I had a lot to learn. I mean, I'm so humbled by all the people who've been at this D&I stuff for 30 years, some of whom I know. And it's just incredible to see how it's evolved. And I stand on lots of shoulders. And I'm so honored to do this in my own way that hopefully resonates with someone, because this work, as you know, Melinda, takes all of us. The messenger, not just the message, is what matters in this work too. So I'm very aware of that and try to do as much as I can with that.
Awesome. And so a couple weeks ago on episode 5, I spoke with Tiffany Yu about people with disabilities. And one thing that I've always kind of thought about is, I've been thinking, not always, so one of the things I've been thinking about for some time is that people with disabilities kind of pull everyone together from the disability community under that one umbrella of people with disabilities. But the LGBTQIA community does not do that. The LGBTQIA plus plus community adds letters and includes more people as it grows. I still think that there's people that are left out of that alphabet, but building that alphabet, growing that rainbow is really, I think, a really powerful thing in the LGBTQ community. Is there specific language that's important, and maybe can you talk about language overall for the community?
Yeah, for sure. One of the places I always start, and I know maybe for some of you this is like totally, I already know this because they're part of your community, Melinda, but sexual orientation is different than gender identity. We can think of these as two parallel but not the same continuum. So the movement coalesced in this series of letters, but really the diversity within the diversity, as I often say, is staggering. I mean, there's so many different identities that are being collapsed into that group that conflate sexual orientation and gender identity, number one, right? So LB, let's see, I get this right, LBQ. Well, LB and G are sexual orientation. Trans T is gender identity. Q is an umbrella term that I think has become really popular amongst younger generations, and older generations have a very specific reaction to it because it was used as a bad word against us, for years. And so, but I really like Q because it encompasses, to me, everything that's non-normative in terms of both sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. And so a lot of more people feel comfortable because now what we understand about identity is that it's not a binary, that we are all somewhere on these continua. And that's what makes this community so beautiful. But it's not just the community that's on the continua. Honestly, I would argue everyone in the population is probably on somewhere on that continuum and is not in a binary. Even if you identify as heterosexual, cisgender, I think it's fascinating, human identity. There's no two of us that are alike. And so the IA intersex is there's some incredible, I just watched a show on Vice about intersex athletes, Olympians. I thought did a really excellent job of educating me for sure about the identity of that community, and the reasons why it needs to be its own letter. And then A refers to asexual, which is a recent addition, and plus kind of encompasses the I and the A sometimes. So you'll hear LGBTQ plus as an inclusive term. I have also incorporated pronouns. And so when I introduce myself, my name is Jennifer, my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I find that such an interesting moment for people to learn what I mean, and then to think about their assumptions and biases about how people identify around us, and how we don't want to make assumptions that the world is through our lens only. And so I consider that something very important that I do. And I usually when I do that on the keynote stages of old, pre-pandemic, I'd say my pronouns are she, her, hers. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? And literally, depending on where I was in the country or the world and what generation I was speaking to, lots of like confused faces. So there's just a lot of opportunity to kind of back up and bring people forward with language. And Melinda, I think we all kind of sprint really fast ahead because I know we're impatient for change, and I know that this is what we stare at all day. But most of the people we work with that I try to influence, I need to really meet them where they're at and make sure they don't get overwhelmed, because overwhelmed people feel stressed, they feel shamed, and then they kind of give up. You want to keep people in the dialogue so that they keep learning.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the plus, the reason why there's a plus is there are a lot more identities that aren't encompassed there. And
Right.
Just a couple that come to mind. That's A is also androgynous, and pansexual is another that is in the plus there. I know there are others that I'm forgetting, but I just want to acknowledge that as well. I think that's really important to keep opening and keep learning and keep adding.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So, my team did some research, and according to the Human Rights Campaign, the HRC, 46% or almost half of LGBTQ workers in the US are closeted. That was a 2019 study. 59% believe it's unprofessional to discuss sexual orientation or gender identity in the workplace. Let's talk about covering, and just to very quickly define it, and Jennifer, please add if you have more here. The covering is essentially actively hiding a piece of your identity. And most people who will cover, they cover in the workplace, and they often cover at home as well, and as they go out into the world. So it can be damaging personally, but people do it because they fear discrimination, harassment, mistreatment, violence if they don't cover. And so how, Jennifer, how do we create safe spaces for people to come out in the workplace and to bring that piece of them to the workplace?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, so let me define covering, and then I'll come back to how we can create cultures of belonging where we cover less, which is the goal, right? Ideally, we eradicate that behavior or the pressure to do so. And it's like you said, it's downplaying a known stigmatized identity. So this is from work done by Kenji Yoshino and Christy Smith, and they wrote a paper with Deloitte called Uncovering Talent, and it's still available online, and I would really recommend reading it. I love teaching about covering because to me, it feels like something I do to myself. It's a decision I make to play small, and to kind of conveniently not talk about what maybe the elephant in the room, or just not talk about anything at all. I mean, maybe people don't even know it's an elephant in the room. It's just something I straight out never discuss. It's also the modification of our speech patterns and the way we look and the interests that we share or we don't share with our colleagues because we are afraid of being judged. So it's something that we do in anticipation of bias, and it's almost like stereotype threat. It's that knowledge that a stereotype will be had about you, and you have a lot of choices when you walk into a situation like that. And for some people, this is an everyday, every hour occurrence. Like, how are people going to deal with me? Like what they see about me, which by the way is perceived diversity. Again, lots of layers. We aren't everything we look, and there's so much invisible that's going on. And so it's kind of the reason why, as an LGBTQ plus person, that I try to come out constantly and not take advantage of what my friend Carmelin calls the passing privilege. Because I can walk through the world and not be necessarily identified as a member of the community that I am a part of. And I think about that a lot because it comes with awesome responsibility. But as a stage performer, definitely, well, I was closeted pretty much. And I was terrified that I wouldn't get cast in roles as the young love interest, bride, whatever, music theater. If people knew who I really was. And also as a business owner, I was afraid that my ability to thrive would be hurt if I disclosed. So anyway, we do cover a lot of aspects of who we are, mental health issues, family and needs for flexibility, what's happening in our families because of systemic racism and oppression, socioeconomic difficulties that we have. We hide and sort of downplay maybe our femininity, maybe our masculinity. So for LGBTQ people, we are masters of disguise. And we are the numbers for LGBTQ people in the paper I just mentioned are like the highest of many groups. Because you're right, 50% of us are closeted in the workplace. And that can take the form of straight out in the closet or the covering, which is some people know about me, some people don't know about me, right? So and then having to come out every single day if you're in a client facing role or you're traveling a lot, or, it's the gay community says like, we have to come out constantly, and sometimes those times don't feel safe for us. And so there's a tremendous risk to authenticity for some of us. And the act of covering is exhausting because to me, it feels like I'm running like two hard drives. Like I'm maybe the expert or the author, or I'm the speaker. And then I'm also like, am I safe? Can I share? What will it do to my message and my credibility if I also talk about that? I'm already a woman, and I'm literally most of the time in groups full of men trying to work with senior teams and boards. And so we do this math in our head and we say like, how much of me can people handle? and what's going to be triggered by that. And then am I really up for that today? Like there's also the question of like how do you feel today? Like how strong, how brave, how courageous, what sort of backstop do you have? How mentally fit and emotionally strong are you feeling today? And I just think that, like, imagine our coworkers and our colleagues walking around carrying this and doing this constantly, like kind of going through this equation. Dr. Vivian Ming, some of you may know, who's a data scientist. I know we're both friends with her, Melinda. Dr. Ming calls it the tax we pay on being different. And Dr. Ming has actually quantified some of that with her cool data scientist ways. But I mean, it would be really neat to understand like how our productivity leaks out, in the covering behavior and experience. We are not as sharp. We're not as focused. We're maybe not on our game. We're tired. We're physically our body tells us we're tired, or we're anxious and we're sweating. So you'll have like physical reactions to it. And the most pernicious, though, I think, is that it makes us feel small. And I think those subconscious messages to your psyche, to your soul, to your belief in yourself, like add up over time. I call it death by 1,000 cuts. And when you're in organizations that don't value you, or you perceive that don't value you, if you do bring your full self to work, like it wears at you. And at some point it breaks. And the break is, I'm going to leave and go to another company that may do this better, where I feel like I can thrive. And so when I speak to company leaders, I say, this is what's happening across like a vast swath of your organization, particularly for any kind of diverse talent. And you, I know, care about bringing them in and keeping them in this organization. And yet it doesn't feel like a place of belonging for them. So what do you want to do about that? And that's when we really can roll up our sleeves and do some pretty cool work.
Yeah, just one kind of reaction to one of the things you said is that constantly coming out, and I think that is a part of allyship too, right? That's why we put our pronouns in our social media. We put our pronouns in our Zoom, for example, is because we as allies also need to do that and create a safe space for everyone to do that.
That's right.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Melinda, I was going to add that allies are needed to lift the covering behaviors before we leave covering. Like, to me, we can't expect those of us who are struggling to bring our full selves to work the most to do all the changing, right? And all the coming to the table and all the risk taking of authenticity, because it's risky. When you don't see any role models, you don't see a lot of people that look like you. What I'm talking about sort of bringing your full self is risky for some of us. So allies have to literally, I think, through their actions and language and storytelling and safe space holding and creating, is we've got to be met halfway, so that the labor is not only on one side, but literally that there's allies that are actually lifting those covering behaviors and lowering that waterline in the organization and saying, you know what, mental health is an issue for lots of people here. We just aren't comfortable talking about it. What would it look like to make that more a part of everyday discussions and strategies and funding and support and visibility? That's the question allies should be asking, which is like, why is our system biased in this way? Why are things okay and the other things not? And then raising attention and using any kind of privilege we have, which I would argue straight allies are privileged compared to LGBTQ people. Because the world is heteronormative in so many ways and cisnormative. And so allies that's an example of like just one incredibly important way that I have been supported by allies to basically make a space. And then if the space is made, then I need to be able to choose, do I want to walk through that door? Do I want to come out? Do I want to, like, am I comfortable? Do I feel psychological safety to do that? But I could never do and be all of who I am, I think, without the allies kind of seeding the ground for that.
And what are some of the things that allies can do and that companies can do to create that safer space, to create that space and leave that space open for people to come out if they want to?
If they want to, right? Because I think you've got to kind of do it consistently over time. I think some allies fall into the trap of, well, I didn't get the response I wanted. I tried. And it's just not, it's not a one and done. It is, I mean, building trust isn't a one and done, right? How is somebody going to trust you with their most vulnerable truth just because you asked once. And it's also like how you ask. It's how you, and not just question asking, but also sharing and being vulnerable yourself about things that have been challenging or are being challenging in your life. I think that when we vulnerably share, and right now during the pandemic, it's a great time to practice this muscle, which is what is proving really difficult for you right now. Where is your heart not well? Where are you struggling? It's not, the onus isn't just on certain people to share how difficult this is, but on all of us. And I find that actually some leaders are, I would say, the least practiced in this. Some of us who are used to sharing our story are sort of out there, right? Always doing it, hoping that more people will come. But the ally reality is there's a lot of folks kind of hesitating and holding back. And so I do think people watch other people's behaviors and they mimic it. And particularly if those people are, if it's a white, straight, and male and cisgender dominated organization, at least at the top of the house, the behaviors and the actions and the storytelling that group engages in can shift entire cultures like very quickly, because people look upwards, they look at a leader and they say, well, it's okay for that person to be talking about it, then I guess it's okay for me to talk about that, or to lead that way, or to incorporate that into my my leadership palette, if you will. And right now it's a really special time to be doing that, obviously, right? It's really uncomfortable for a lot of people. So it's a good time to investigate how little you know about your colleagues, actually. We're beaming into each other's houses. We're seeing each other's same-sex partners and kids. Maybe we can't hide that anymore. Like, it is really on display in a way, whether we like it or not. There's kind of this forced transparency right now that while I am very uncomfortable for some who carefully curated their lives, their work lives, because of all the fears we've been talking about. But I'm also really hopeful that somehow this is almost like ripping off a Band-Aid with each other, and like establishing, like quickly dropping into that kind of trust, because covering looks so different in a virtual world. And I've had lots of people say, I'm a woman of color, and like I find that I'm putting less energy towards all of this than I did in the physical workplace. There's statistics that show that women in open office plans, female employees, like feel very scrutinized in open office plans, for example, about their appearance. Like, it's one of the many pieces of data that I have found really interesting in terms of what's not working about the open office. And I don't even know if we'll ever return to those again. So maybe we don't need to talk about that for a while, but and then I've had like a friend who's non-binary say, it's been incredible to just be on Zoom and not feel like I'm misgendered constantly. And so our physical appearance triggers assumptions in others, right? And to remove sort of all of us, it opens up the door, I think, for some sidestep of some of the diversity dimensions that really like prove difficult for a lot of us. So not a perfect fix, but just a really interesting thing to think about. So I do think that there's a possible quantum leap here, for being just seen and heard for our work, and being sort of more purely interacted with at this distance, which is really ironic, because you would think that would have been more possible in a physical world. But Melinda, I think I've lost track of your original question.
What are a few practical things that people can do in the workplace to really create that safe space to ensure, whether it's through working on the culture, or it's working on policy, on internal workplace policies?
Yeah. Well, I do think too, I mean, somebody just brought up that there can be privilege and allyship within diverse groups, right? So I want to dive into that for a minute. It's so important.
Mm-hmm.
So privilege just doesn't end because you're in a diverse group. You're in an affinity group and you do inclusive leadership perfectly. It doesn't mean, just because that's your lived experience, it doesn't mean that you have the skills and the mindsets and the consistent behavior of an inclusive leader. So we all have work to do. In the LGBTQ community, there are still white cisgender men in the community. And those identities carry privilege with them. And so I think the onus, we've got to walk the talk in our own communities, right? At the same time as we expect this behavior in everybody else in the organization. So I do think we've got to get real about that within our communities. I know for me, what I do with that is that I've been out for 25 years now, and so I'm pretty out in who I am, but there's so much learning I have to still do. I consider as an ally, as a cis gay woman, there is a ton of learning I need to do about sexism, homophobia, transphobia, racism in the LGBTQ plus community, and how I can use my voice as an ally to ameliorate all of that as an insider. And so allyship is not just like one demographic on high, like sort of imparting something. It has to start amongst us. And we've got to be really careful about how we silo our identities, right? And ERGs are great and important, but it's also encouraged that like vertical thinking instead of the cross identity allyship that we really need amongst us, right? And so I really encourage all of us to like do this thinking. Everybody has some kind of privilege that you are probably underutilizing. So that's one piece. And then let's see, I'm reading in some of the questions in the chat. This is fascinating. Thank you, Libra. Really good to see you. The allies, teleworking is better or worse for people to be seen at work. I honestly think that there's a lot of potential to, if we are just like removing that physical appearance piece and we're sort of shoulders up. I do think, imagine the implications for trans folks and gender non-binary folks around, being able to kind of choose how you show up or not be on video at all, if that's not what you need to do and want to do, and being a voice on the phone is, I think, a fantasy for a lot of people who walk around in bodies that trigger. So, just imagine that. And I think if you're somebody who this is not resonating with, I'm telling you, it's true for a lot of other people. And so part of the work of allyship is literally when I'm the only one in the room and I can reflect these realities, like that's my job. And I hope I'm not the only one in the room that can speak to this, and because it's not my lived experience, but allyship means, using that voice and ensuring others are brought to that table. But if you're the only one at that table, like it is incumbent on you to make sure that that is raised and represented, and then that it changes, going forward. And so anyway, it's just been an incredible learning experience. I mean, for me, it's interesting also that I now am applying my aspiring allyship to the community of people with disabilities. And Melinda, I've learned so much from you about how you've managed your calls and subtitles and interpreters and how you narrate all the content on your slides. Like you are, so I have to compliment you. And I've learned so much, and so much of the business world is not doing any of these things. And so as a practice, I'm trying to do things for my calls and also illustrate what I'm doing and why I'm doing them, so that it's always a teaching moment. And I think that means that somebody else doesn't have to come forward and point things out because I am pointing them out. And that means less emotional labor for somebody that's probably really struggling to bring their full selves and struggling perhaps with bias and covering. Like if I can shoulder some of that, like give it to me. And so you asked, like, what can we do in organizations? Allies have to be more overt. I mean, we've got to have more people talking like this, more people raising issues, more people sharing vulnerably about who they are, even if they look like a person of privilege, because we kind of explode that. Like I never know who's in a room. Even though I think I do, I don't. And I've been shown the truth and been surprised so many times and so humbled that I wasn't being an inclusive leader either, and that's been really humbling to me and really beautiful, actually, that people trust you with this stuff. But we've got to encourage executives and people who don't think diversity is somebody else's job. We've got to build that muscle in those leaders to be able to be fluent in this and do it in an authentic and personal way, not just from the head, but from the heart.
And also to be okay with some missteps and to help them as they misstep, because inevitably as allies we do.
Yes.
And I do feel that being careful about shaming and by provoking guilt And if feelings of shame and guilt are not the answer, I think that we have to also create that safe space for leadership to be able to learn and grow, and support them and push them in that learning and growth.
It's so true, Melinda. I know we're very aligned on that. Like the shaming stuff is, I mean, who learns from a place of shame? I mean, it can be, I think, a temporary state, and it probably it needs to be felt because we should be ashamed of what we have participated in and what we
Right,
haven't
right, fair enough.
challenged,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I can't necessarily work forward with somebody that's stuck in that place. And the problem with shame is that I give up. I feel overwhelmed. I feel discouraged. And we have to believe that allyship and a future different behaviors are possible for ourselves, like in order to undertake that journey. It's just human psychology. So I do think, as hard as it might be and as frustrated as a lot of us are with the pace of change, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
why are we still having this conversation? And
Mm.
why are allies asking for checklists, right? Like, why do I have to explain again, how to do this and how to do that? I just think we've got to be careful with that, because so much of us, we're in this work, we listen to it all day. Some of us, it's our lived experience. So we know this deeply, but there's so many people that don't. And so we say in consulting, like, meet the client where they're at, meet the learner where they're at, like
Mm.
really, and remember that you were on a learning journey you
Absolutely.
probably are on a learning journey. And
Hopefully
how would
we
that,
all are. There's no way
right,
that we can all be like perfect allies for each other in this space. Even if we are from a marginalized group or multiple marginalized identities, there's
right,
still a lot of room for growth and understanding of other marginalized identities.
totally,
Yeah.
totally,
And then one thing that just kind of occurred to me as we're talking is that part of allyship is recognizing those feelings of guilt and those feelings of shame, and moving past that. Because I know the first time that I heard the word privilege, for example, I was like, oh, I did not like it. I did not like it. And now I'm kind of, now I recognize it and know that I have this privilege. But it took me, there was some shame and some guilt in that, and some
mm,
was probably misplaced, and some of it was real. And I think
mm.
part of allyship is really that part of growth as well, is recognizing that and moving past that.
I agree. Yeah. And even if it does, there's no timetable, there's no, timeline.
Mm.
I only ask leaders to just make sure you're moving forward, even if it's small steps, and even if you perhaps achieve a milestone and you stay there for a while, because things also with this work have to be embodied. They can't just be an intellectual exercise, or it can't be performative allyship, right? Like we talk
Mm.
about. But I think it's got to be deeply felt. And that takes a while. That is not something you can snap your fingers and say you're an ally tomorrow. Like, you can start by putting rainbow flags places, or sharing your pronouns, or, talking about pride more openly and how you're an ally. But we always say in the community, pride isn't just once a year, it's 365 days a year. I'm proud. And so organizations also have to resist the temptation to kind of pull out all the stops around one cultural, celebration, but not really be there on a day-to-day basis. And it's really, to me, where the rubber hits the road isn't necessarily pride, but it's how many people are still closeted in the workplace? To me, that's the metric that keeps me up at night. It's like, what is it about our system that is making people feel, even though these companies are award-winning companies, even though they're on Diversity Inc.'s top 50 companies, they have tons of closeted employees. Like, it's just this conundrum. It's same with people with disabilities. When we are asked to check a box about who we really are, and we get that employee engagement survey, we're the ones that don't trust our institution enough to check the box. And then you have senior leaders coming to us and saying, well, we don't have that many these folks, or we can't count how many people. And therefore, like, how do we know that this is a pressing issue for us from an employee engagement standpoint? So, but I'm not telling everybody you have to be out at all. I'm just pointing out, like, how my consultant brain works, which is that if the struggle is real, and I don't want anyone to feel that they're going to have to come out into an unsafe space. Like, I wouldn't do that. And maybe that's why I became a consultant, Melinda, because I was like, I just like, this is a waste of my time. And I want to just be, be all of who I am, because that's where I can do my best work, right? Period. And that's true for all of us. But I know there is a question about like, do we have to be out as somebody to be a leader and a voice in D&I? Do we have to declare our labels to contextualize this work? It's a fascinating question. I mean, I've had, people on panels with me that were allegedly an ally on the panel, and then we get off the panel and he takes me aside and he says, actually, I just recently came out. I'm a 55-year-old married man. I have a heterosexual relationship with my wife, but I'm starting the process of coming out. So that person was an ally on my panel and just wasn't ready to be out. So again, there's like no timeline. I think when you disclose is up to you. I think but just remember that part of our work is aligning ourselves and bringing our full selves to work so that we have the credibility and really, frankly, the power of that as we are change agents, right? I mean, it's like fuel, it's rocket fuel. So while we don't have to be out, I think that the effectiveness of having a personal connection to this work and that lived experience and that passion and that context makes you extra powerful and effective when you join it with all the other organizational change skills that you need as a leader in the DEI space.
Yeah. So as I said, we can talk for hours. And we just kind of grazed over a few things that I just want to call out, and I don't know that we have a lot of time to address it. We addressed a little bit as we were talking. One is intersectionality, which we kind of said in lots of different ways, but didn't say that word. And I think that is really important. Especially in all of this work around diversity and inclusion, is recognizing that some people have many marginalized identities, and the LGBTQIA plus community is no exception, and you can be multiple letters within that, right? And yes. And then particularly trans women of color with disabilities are a subset of that community that are really important to make sure that we hold space for, to support, and because so many unique things happen with them, and barriers that are placed in front of them. And someone in the chat also mentioned class, which is another aspect of this, age, etc. So I just wanted to call that and make sure that we say that out loud here, because it is so important. And then I also want to make sure that we address ERGs, because you have done a ton of work with companies around how to, and ERGs, sorry, let me just say, for those who don't know, ERGs, employee resource groups, affinity groups, sometimes companies will have specific names based on their company name as well. So ERGs, you've done a lot of work around helping companies to set them up, to lay the foundations, and then to make them as successful as they can be within the workplace, as supportive as they can be in the workplace. Can you talk a little bit about some of the best practices around LGBTQIA ERGs in particular?
Yeah, one of my favorite topics. I mean, ERGs are how I cut my teeth as a consultant, a baby D&I consultant, like 13, 14 years ago. It was how my first dollar that I made from this kind of work was a generous LGBTQ, we didn't say Q at the time, LGBTI group or pride group that brought me in as a baby consultant and entrusted me with their offsite for strategic planning or something. I have such fond memories of really actually shaping my understanding of the business case by going to conferences like Out and Equal and hearing how this community, along with the Corporate Equality Index, which is super helpful from HRC because it gives you basically a roadmap for inclusive LGBTQ organizations. So the Corporate Equality Index is really an important thing to know about. It's a benchmark for our community for workplaces, and it's very detailed, and companies fight to get 100%. Every 2 years, they up the ante, and every 2 years, like all the companies follow suit and make sure that they're providing everything in that list, because that's kind of the gold standard for a lot of us. Not perfect at all. So I know I'm like, don't at me, but it's something. And I think it's something actually that a lot of communities don't have, that orients, what does this look like, and defines it so that it gives companies something to shoot for, which is really important. But ERGs for LGBTQIA, they need to be intersectional. So I want to come back to your point about intersectionality, which is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, woman of color, professor, amazing. And it was the overlapping stigmatized identities in sometimes multiple cases. But ERGs are full of intersectionality, or rather need to be. Not always. So sometimes I encounter a women's network that has no women of color and no queer identified women. And I'll say, where's the diversity here? What sort of signals are being sent around the welcoming nature of this group, the leadership of that group, the goals and strategies the group is taking on, et cetera. So I will find an LGBTQ group that's has all perhaps cis men in the leadership positions. And in fact, that's a very, very common thing, actually. And so we've got to watch that. And I think we've got to orient the groups. Now there's so many groups. I mean, in some of the companies I work with, there are like 100 network groups and maybe 12 primary groups. And then there's a lot of other kind of interest groups, I'd say. But there's an opportunity for intersectionality to be fostered in the membership of the groups, in the programming and the education the groups provide. And I agree, Melinda, if we pay attention to those who are dealing with the most intersectionality dynamics, then our strategies will benefit all of us. So let's focus on the most marginalized, and it's a word I have a tricky relationship with, marginalized. I like
Me too.
underestimated. And perhaps, you can fill in a lot, but literally if we focus on that group, all of us will benefit in terms of the conversation that we can have. So I fully expect, I task ERGs when I'm working on their strategies with them to look through everything with an intersectional lens. Who are they attracting and not attracting right now? Why? What would be appealing and helpful in terms of what ERGs exist to do, which is really build community, educate their organization, advise the company on sales, products, marketing, all the stuff in the marketplace, make sure that talent demographic is moving up the pipeline with as few challenges or headwinds as possible, which we will agree is still requiring a lot of work. But I think that we can't afford anymore to just get some people through. We have to get all of us through. So that's the intersectional lens in my mind. And I think now is a time to have a really deep and honest conversation about equity. And I with this pandemic, we've been shown so many disparate impacts. And I think finally, some folks are connecting the dots to say, diversity as it was practiced wasn't inclusive. Could we build something better? And with the next generation coming in who is super intersectional, they are expecting, I think, some of these structures that have been in place for a while to be intersectional. And I think if you don't know what that word means, you're behind the eight ball quite a bit. So I'm really excited. I wonder if ERGs, I'm asked a lot, will they disappear as this next generation comes in that doesn't have such a need for safe space? Who's perhaps out in the interview, who's incredibly proud of being gender non-binary and is like, why would I not share that in an interview? Like what? Or getting into an interview and saying, what do you mean you don't have an LGBTQIA network? Or that you don't have like particular leadership development programs for this community and other communities. These are the tough questions that I really am counting on this next generation to push on, because companies are behind the eight ball in so many ways, and not at all ready for a super diverse and inclusive and like self-appreciating, I hope, generation that's coming in and saying, this is all of me, like here's everything I come with, and I expect to bring my full self to work and not cover, and I want to work for a company whose values align with mine. What a great call to action that like our generation, I think, has moved the ball considerably, but there is probably nothing like a tsunami of a generation with totally different viewpoints and values about all this, like coming in and ascending into leadership. And it's really going to change the culture, I think, probably faster than we've been able to.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody wants to look deeper into how the LGBTQ community is being disproportionately affected by COVID-19, the Human Rights Campaign, again, we keep talking about them. They're a great resource, and they did a study on that. So there's lots of information. That report will include that in our follow-up resources available on our event follow-up email, as well as our YouTube channel and our SoundCloud channel as well. We are running out of time. So I think the last question, and then obviously brief, is where people can learn more about you and your work. And I will say that this is probably backwards, but this is on my bookshelf.
It looks good. That's my first book.
Okay.
That's my first
That's
book.
her first book.
Yay.
There's another one.
There's a second one. I'm a glutton for punishment.
One. I'm still working on my first, so I'm looking for advice there. Person. And then you also just released a report on your website. So anyway, real quick, where can people learn more?
Yes. So please visit us at Jennifer Brown Speaks. And there you can download a first chapter of the second book, which is called How to Be an Inclusive Leader. You can also take a free assessment, the Inclusive Leader Assessment, and it's 10 minutes, and it'll give you a little report with some resources about where you are in the Inclusive Leader Continuum, which is the basis of the second book. Melinda, I'm big on social. You and I dance all the time on Twitter. So I'm at Jennifer Brown, at Jennifer Brown Speaks on Instagram. And I have a podcast called The Will to Change. So I did want to make a plug for that. And then we have a wonderful thought leadership paper on inclusion in the future of work that's come out of a lot of the community calls we've been doing. That's made me so much, filled my head with a lot of ideas about what's possible. So that would be great to share perhaps, after the fact, and I'll get you the link, Melinda, but you can send us an email at info@Jennifer Brown Consulting if you'd like to get a copy of that report, and we'll make sure that you get one.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all you do. And everybody, keep this going, keep the learning and the conversations going, and be brave. Use some new language, take a new action. And thank you all for joining us. Join us each week for Leading with Empathy and Allyship. You can sign up to attend live or catch the podcast or the video. And you can stay in the loop by going to changecatalyst.co, changecatalyst.co, and signing up for our newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and YouTube channel, and we will see you